The morning she returned to Ashvere Park, the household did not know whether to bow or to flee. Constance Paley stood at the bottom of the servants' stair, a basket of laundered linens balanced against her hip, and watched the carriage arrive through the narrow window above the scullery sink. She had stood in that precise spot 11 years ago, watching a different carriage depart. She had been 15 then. She was 26 now, and the woman descending the carriage steps wore a Duchess's widow veil and moved as though the gravel existed to receive her. Constance did not move. She held the basket tighter and waited for the feeling in her chest to name itself. The Duchess of Ashvere had been dead for 3 years. That was what the parish register said. That was what the mourning wreaths had announced, and the stone in the family vault, and the sealed letter that had arrived from the continent and been accepted without question by everyone except Constance, who had been there the night the Duchess packed her own trunk and pressed a sovereign into the hand of the only servant, young enough and discreet enough to say nothing. Her name had been Lady Mira Hollander before she married. She was 47 now, though the household believed her to be 59. Constance had always known the difference. She had been the one to help dress the Duchess on the morning of the first ball of Constance's service, and she had seen the inscription inside the Duchess's traveling case. Mira, born the 14th of March, 1779. The question was what the Duke of Ashvere, the dead man's son and new owner of everything inside these walls, intended to do about it. His carriage had arrived 3 days before the Duchess's. Constance had heard him before she saw him. A quiet voice issuing a single instruction to the steward. Unhurried. The words spoken as though the house itself were expected to listen. She had looked up from the corridor and seen him standing at the foot of the main stair. Tall, very still, dark coat, white cravat, the kind of stillness that came from a man who had long since stopped needing to fill silence with noise. He had turned his head and found her eyes across the hall before she could look away. He had said nothing. He had simply looked at her for the space of 2 full breaths. And then the steward had spoken, and he had moved on. She had not slept well since. His name was Edmund Farr, the 4th Duke of Ashvere, and he had taken the title 18 months ago when his father's final illness concluded. He was 34. He had served in the peninsula and returned with a quietness that sat differently from the quietness he had possessed before, according to Mrs. Rowe, the housekeeper, who had been at Ashvere since before Constance was born. He had a reputation among the county for being fair, economical with his emotions, and unlikely to be moved by appeals to sentiment. He had not been at Ashvere the night the Duchess left. He had been at his own estate in Northumberland, managing his inheritance, and the letter announcing his father's second wife's death had reached him, by all accounts, without provoking any visible response. Constance told herself this as she carried the linens upstairs and delivered them to the linen press and counted the pillowcases with careful hands. He was a duke. She was a servant. She had been a servant since she was 14, the orphaned daughter of a clergyman without living relatives, placed in service at Ashvere, because the late Duke had known her father. She had worked in this house for 12 years. She knew where every candlestick was stored, and which floorboards creaked, and which windows let in a particular quality of autumn light that made the east corridor glow at 4 in the afternoon. She knew things about this house that its owners had never thought to wonder whether she knew. She knew the Duchess was not dead. The morning the Duchess of Ashvere appeared in the drawing-room and invited the staff to attend her, Constance stood in the back row with her hands folded and her face quiet. She was very good at quiet. The Duchess, Mira Farah by marriage, had been a beautiful woman in her youth, and was an arresting woman now. the kind of face that had once assembled rooms around it, and still could if it chose to. She wore lavender, which was morning's end, and her silver hair was dressed simply. She looked at the assembled servants one by one, the practiced assessment of a woman accustomed to deciding what people were worth. When her gaze reached Constance, it stopped. Something passed between them. Not warmth, precisely. Recognition. "I shall require a personal maid," the Duchess said. "Miss Paley, I believe you will suit." Mrs. Rowe looked startled. A personal maid was not Constance's position, had never been Constance's position. She was a household maid of the upper sort, competent at linen and silver and the arrangement of flowers. The Duchess's choice was irregular. Constance said, "Yes, Your Grace," and felt the floor shift slightly beneath her. If you have ever found yourself standing at the edge of a secret that is no longer only yours to keep, then you understand something of what the next 3 days cost Constance. Share this story with someone who loves Regency secrets, and stay close, because the Duchess's return was only the beginning of what Constance would be required to know. The secret itself was not complicated. It was the weight of it that made it difficult. The late Duke, Edmund's father, had been 53 when he married Mira Hollander. She had been 29, newly arrived from a family in reduced circumstances, beautiful and composed, and in possession of a quality that Constance had later understood as the specific dignity of a woman who has decided to survive whatever the world offers her. The marriage had been a transaction, as most such marriages were. He had wanted youth and a certain social grace. She had needed a position and security. The age she had given the household, and which had eventually appeared in the parish record maintained by the estate's own vicar, was 36. It was a lie told to make the match appear less uneven, and the late Duke had known it and had not cared. But the Duchess had cared. She had cared in the particular way of a woman who understands that a lie told to smooth a social transaction can become, over 20 years, the foundation of an entirely different prison. When the late Duke had grown ill and begun speaking of the vault and the succession, he had also begun speaking of the age he would have inscribed on the stone. And the inscription, the Duchess had understood, would make her a woman already in her dotage in the eyes of any solicitor who examined it, any claimant who wished to contest her jointure, any court that took an interest in how an aging widow had managed her late husband's affairs. She had left. She had gone to a cousin in Geneva. She had arranged through an intermediary who had since died of fever for a letter to be sent from the continent announcing her own passing. She had, in short, committed a fraud that was clean and efficient, and very nearly perfect. The only flaw was Constance, who had seen the inscription inside the traveling case, and had pressed a sovereign, and had been 15, and had not understood yet what she was holding. He understood it within 4 days of his stepmother's arrival. Constance knew this, because he summoned her. He did it through Mrs. Rowe, which was correct procedure, and the message was simply that His Grace wished to speak with Miss Paley at 9:30 in the library. Constance dressed with particular care that morning, which she told herself was only proper when called to attend the Duke. She wore her best afternoon dress, a plain gray wool that was neat and showed no wear at the collar. She pinned her hair more precisely than usual. She was aware of doing all of this, and aware that she was aware, and told herself to stop. The library at Ashvere was a room she had always loved. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, a fire that the footman kept going from September through April, 2 deep chairs angled toward the windows, and a smell that was particular to old books and beeswax, and something else she had never found the word for. She had polished the brass fittings in this room 100 times. She stood inside the door and waited. He was at the window with his back to her. He was looking at the east lawn where the morning frost was still on the grass. He did not turn immediately. When he did, he moved quietly, the way he always moved, and he looked at her for a moment before he indicated the chair. "Sit down, Miss Paley." She sat. He remained standing, which was his right, but he did not use the height of it as a weapon. He simply stood with his hands loosely at his sides and looked at her with the gray eyes she had noticed across the entrance hall 3 weeks ago. "You have been in this household for 12 years, he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "You were here the year my father married the woman who now calls herself the Duchess of Ashvere." A pause. "And the year she left." She did not answer immediately. She looked at the fire and decided in the space of 3 seconds what kind of person she intended to be in this room, at this moment, with this particular man. "I was, Your Grace." He waited. "I was present on the evening Her Grace departed," Constance said. "I helped her carry her trunk to the side door. She gave me a coin and asked me to say nothing. I was 15 years old, and I said nothing." "And the letter from the continent?" "I do not know how it was arranged. I know only that Her Grace was alive when she left this house, and I had no reason to believe she had died. I did not seek out the information, and I did not repeat what I knew." Something shifted in his face. Not softness, precisely. A kind of attention that was different from the attention he had been paying before. "She has returned," he said, "because her cousin in Geneva died, and left her circumstances altered, and because she believes that 11 years is long enough for the relevant parties to have ceased caring." He said this without inflection. "She is incorrect about that last part." "Yes, Your Grace." "The jointure question is a practical matter. My father's will was specific. If she was 29 when they married, her jointure calculation is one figure. If she was 36, as the record states, it is another." He moved to the chair across from her and sat, and the fire was between them, and the room felt smaller. "I am not asking you to give evidence in a court. I am asking you what you know." She looked at him directly. She had not allowed herself to do this until now. "I know that Her Grace was born in 1779, she said. "I saw it inscribed in her own hand on the inside of her traveling case the morning of my first week in service. I was not intended to see it. I am telling you this now because you have asked me directly, and I will not lie to a direct question, regardless of what it costs me." The room was very quiet. Outside, a blackbird was making a noise in the hedge. "It will not cost you your position," he said. "I want to be clear about that." She had not expected that. She felt it land somewhere below her sternum and did not know what to do with it. "What you have told me is consistent with what I have already established through other means," he said. "The Geneva intermediary left correspondence. My solicitor has examined it. I did not ask you here to gather evidence I lacked. I asked you here because I wanted to understand who in this household has been carrying this alone, and for how long." She said, 11 years, Your Grace." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a long time," he said, "for someone who was 15 when they were handed it." She did not trust herself to speak, so she looked at the fire instead. The coals had settled, and the light was orange and steady. "You may go," he said. "I will speak with Mrs. Rowe about reassigning you from Her Grace's personal service. It is not a position that suits your actual station, and it should not have been offered in a way that placed you in proximity to a person who has reason to want your discretion managed." She stood. She straightened her skirts. She looked at him one more time. "Your Grace," she said, and went. The days that followed were quieter than she expected. The Duchess remained in the house, which surprised her. Whatever he had said to his stepmother in the room she was not permitted to know. It had resulted in the Duchess taking her meals in the sitting room and appearing at the dining table only when invited. Mrs. Rowe attributed this to the natural adjustment of a woman returning after a long absence. Constance attributed it to the specific adjustment of a woman who had been told, quietly and without cruelty, the precise position she occupied. She saw him in the corridor twice that week. He nodded, the brief, precise acknowledgement of a man who does not forget the people in his household, and she curtsied, the brief, precise response of a woman who does not presume on a conversation conducted in confidence. The third time was at the bottom of the east stair, where she was carrying a branch of autumn roses from the garden to the morning room, and he was coming from the estate room with a leather document case under his arm, and they very nearly collided. She stepped back. He stepped forward. For a moment, neither of them was quite sure which direction was correct. "Miss Paley," he said. "Your Grace." She had the roses in both hands. They smelled of autumn, the faint sweetness that comes when something beautiful is at the end of its last week. He looked at the roses and then at her face, and said nothing for long enough that she became aware of the pulse at the base of her throat. "The East Garden is past its season," he said finally. "Yes, Your Grace. These are the last of the climbers. I thought the morning room could use them before they're gone." "Yes," he said. He moved past her and then stopped, his hand on the newel post. She did not turn. She was very aware of not turning. "The solicitor arrives on Thursday. There will be a household meeting to explain the arrangements." "Yes, Your Grace." "You will hear nothing that contradicts what you told me in the library." She turned then. She could not help it. He was looking at her with the gray eyes, steady and unreadable, and reading her completely. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. He went up the stairs. She stood at the bottom and listened to his footsteps until they were gone. And then she carried the roses to the morning room and arranged them in the blue vase, and told herself that a woman of 26, with no family, and no position beyond the one she worked for, was a fool to feel what she was feeling. She was very good at telling herself things that did not take. The solicitor arrived on Thursday. His name was Mr. Clifford Barnett of the firm. Barnett and Lee, a slight man of 50 with an expression that suggested he had spent decades arranging the world's untidy human affairs into tidy legal categories. He arrived with a black case, a younger associate, and the specific composure of a man who has been told something surprising and has had sufficient time to become unsurprised by it. The household meeting was brief. He stood at the head of the table in the servants' hall, which was an unusual choice, and one that caused Mrs. Rowe to look at him with something close to approval. He said that the Duchess of Ashvere had returned, and that certain questions regarding the late Duke's estate had required clarification. He said that those questions had now been resolved, and that the household's routine would continue unchanged. He said that any servant who had reason to be uncertain about their position should speak to Mrs. Rowe, and the matter would be addressed. He said, looking at no one in particular, and at Constance in particular, that loyal service was its own kind of value, and that it would be recognized as such. Mrs. Rowe sniffed. Several of the younger maids exchanged glances. Constance looked at the table. The meeting ended. The solicitor went into the library with the Duke, and the door closed. The Duchess, Constance later learned from Mrs. Rowe, had also been in the library. She did not learn what was said. She learned the result of it 2 days later, when Mrs. Rowe told her that Her Grace would be removing to the Dower House at Westhall, a smaller estate 40 miles distant, and that the household at Ashvere was to prepare her rooms for departure by the following Monday. She helped pack the Duchess's trunks. She did it correctly and carefully, the way she did every task. And when she lifted the Duchess's traveling case from the wardrobe shelf, the inscription was still there, on the inside of the lid, in the Duchess's young handwriting, and she closed the case and fastened it, and carried it to the landing for the footman. The Duchess was watching from the doorway. "You could have said something," the Duchess said, 11 years ago, or at any point since. Constance set the case down on the landing and faced her. She was 10 inches shorter than the Duchess, and 21 years younger, and had no diamonds and no title, and she looked at the woman across the space between them. "You asked me not to," Constance said. Something moved across the Duchess's face that was not quite gratitude and not quite guilt, and was some third thing that did not have a pleasant name. "Yes," the Duchess said. "I did." She turned and went back into her room. Constance went back downstairs. The last day of October was cold, the kind of cold that comes from the north and carries the smell of the coming season with it. Constance was in the East Garden in the afternoon, cutting back the last of the rose canes, when she heard the footstep on the gravel, and looked up. He was standing at the garden gate in his coat and his dark hat, and he was looking at her in the way he had that meant he had been looking for a moment before she noticed. "Mrs. Rowe says you are the one who manages the roses," he said. "Yes, Your Grace. The head gardener sees to the formal beds, but the east climbers were always kept by the household maids. I have done them for 6 years." He came through the gate and stood a few feet away, which was a correct distance for an outdoor conversation. He looked at the canes she had been tying back. He looked at her hands, which were in their work gloves. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the position of housekeeper." She waited. "Mrs. Rowe is 61. She is asked to retire in the spring. She informed me this morning, and I told her I would require time to consider a replacement." He looked at the roses rather than at her. "I have not required as much time as I suggested I would." The cold air was very still. A leaf came down from the copper beech at the garden's edge and fell between them on the path. "I am aware that it is an unusual choice," he said. "You are 26. The position is usually held by a woman of considerably more years." "Mrs. Rowe was 30 when she took it," Constance said before she could stop herself. She said, "Forgive me, Your Grace." "How do you know that?" "She told me. She says she was considered too young by nearly everyone, and that the late Duke gave her the position anyway because she could account for every piece of silver in the house without a written inventory." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile. It was the first time she had seen anything close to one. "Can you?" he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "I thought you could." He looked at her directly now, the gray eyes quiet and certain, and asking something that was not about the silver at all. "There are things that require saying plainly, Miss Paley, and I have spent enough of my life not saying them. You have been in this house longer than I have. You know its secrets, and have kept them honestly, which is a rarer quality than the keeping alone. I am offering you Mrs. Rowe's position, because you are the right person for it. I am asking you to consider whether you are prepared to accept it." She was aware of the cold, and the bare canes, and the smell of autumn, and the specific quality of his attention, which was the kind a person feels not in the mind, but somewhere lower, somewhere that does not consult the mind before it reports. "I am prepared," she said. He nodded, once. "Good," he said. Then, a pause that had weight in it. "Constance." It was the first time he had used her name. She felt it like a hand at the center of her chest. "Your Grace," she said, and it came out steadier than she had any right to expect. He looked at her for one moment more, and then turned and walked back through the gate and across the gravel toward the house. She watched him until he was inside and the door had closed, and then she turned back to the roses and stood with her secateurs in her hand and the cold around her, and said nothing, and felt everything. That winter, she learned that love could begin in the middle of a sentence about household positions, in the middle of a cold October garden, in the middle of a life that had not previously seemed to leave room for it. That love in such circumstances announces itself not as a decision, but as a discovery. The way you discover that the book you thought you were reading for information has also, without your permission, begun to mean something to you. He was in his library every morning at 7 and available to the household at 9. He took his meals at the stated hours and altered the household routine no more than was necessary, and said what he meant in as few words as the meaning required. He had brought back from Northumberland a habit of walking the perimeter of the grounds before dark, regardless of the weather, which the servants attributed to military training and which Constance observed from the upstairs windows with a regularity she chose not to examine closely. He did not presume. He did not summon her for private conversations under cover of household business. He was scrupulously correct in every particular, and she was scrupulously correct in return, and the correctness between them was the most charged thing she had experienced since the moment at the foot of the east stair with the roses. December brought the county assembly, which he attended as he attended all county obligations, with the specific composure of a man performing a duty he has made peace with. He returned in the small hours, and Mrs. Rowe reported that Lady Hargreave had made considerable efforts to secure his attention for her niece, Miss Priscilla Hargreave, who was 19 and had £6,000 and a complexion the county had agreed was very fine indeed. Mrs. Rowe reported this in the housekeeper's sitting room, where Constance was going over the candle accounts, and she reported it in the careful way of a woman who is not sure whether she is offering information or advice. Constance thanked her and went on with the candle accounts. She was a servant. She had been a servant since she was 14. A duke required a wife of rank and fortune and connections. The kindness he had shown her was the kindness of a decent man to a person in his household who had been placed in an impossible position and handled it with integrity. It was not more than that. She wrote the candle accounts in her neat hand and told herself so. The letter arrived on the 15th of December. It was addressed to the Duke from a Mr. Thomas Paley of the Middle Temple, barrister, and it came in the Morning Post, and Constance carried it from the post tray to the library door herself, which was housekeeper's work, and slid it under with the other correspondence. She had not known there was a Mr. Thomas Paley of the Middle Temple. She had believed herself without living relatives since she was 14. She had been told so. She learned that she had been told wrong on the 18th of December. When he summoned her to the library and said, his hands on the desk, his face quiet, "I have been in correspondence with your uncle, who has identified himself as your mother's brother. He is a barrister in London. He states that he was not aware of your circumstances until a month ago, when an inquiry I commissioned produced his name." She sat very still. "You commissioned an inquiry," she said. "Yes." He did not look away. "I commissioned it in October." October, the East Garden, the first time he had said her name. She was aware of her breath doing something complicated. "He wishes to make your acquaintance," the Duke said. "He has no children. He describes himself as astonished and distressed that you were placed in service without his knowledge. He has written to ask whether you would be willing to correspond." She looked at the fire. She looked at her hands on her knees. She looked at the man across the desk who had spent 6 weeks quietly attempting to give her back a family without telling her he was doing it. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "You did not have to do that." "No," he said, "I did not." The room held the fire's warmth and the smell of beeswax and books, and the silence that had been between them since October. "Why did you?" she said. He looked at her for the length of 2 breaths, and then he stood and came around the desk, and she stood because you stand when a duke stands, and they were 3 feet apart in the library, and the fire was behind her, and the gray eyes were the color of the winter sky outside, and he said, plainly, because he had said he spent enough of his life not saying things plainly, because you are the most honest person in this house, because you have held other people's secrets with a care that has cost you, and I wanted to see what it looked like when something came to you instead. And because I have been finding reasons to be in the East Corridor since October, and I do not believe in pretending otherwise. She said nothing. Her mouth said nothing. Her hands were entirely honest about what they wanted, which was to reach across 3 feet of library air and hold on to something. I am aware of the impropriety, he said. I am also aware that propriety is a language I have always spoken, and that it is not, in this particular moment, sufficient. Your Grace, she said. Edmund, he said. Not now. Not yet. I want to say it plainly, so that when the time comes, there is no misunderstanding on either side. I am not offering you a housekeeper's position as a consolation. I am not offering you the discovery of your uncle as a gift without expectation. I am telling you that I have not looked at Miss Hargreaves' complexion, and that the county assembly was, from beginning to end, an exercise in the specific discomfort of being in a room where the wrong person is not present. She looked at him. She felt the fire at her back, and the winter light from the window, and the 11 years of this house around her, and the weight of the name he had said in the garden, and the weight of what he was saying now. I think, she said, that you should speak to my uncle first. Something broke open in his face. She had never seen it do that before. It lasted only a moment before the composure returned. But she had seen it. Yes, he said. I will. Christmas came to Ashvere that year with the particular quality of a house that is beginning to understand what it is becoming. He dined with the senior household on Christmas Eve, which was not unheard of for a duke, but was unusual enough to cause Mrs. Rowe to press her best cap into service. He spoke to the housekeeper, who was Constance, about the spring planning and the state of the East Garden, and Constance spoke to him about the spring planning and the East Garden, and both of them knew they were also speaking about something else, which is a particular pleasure of a particular kind of conversation, and one that the Regency period, for all its constraints, understood very well. Her uncle arrived at Ashvere on the 27th of December. He was a lean man of 53, with Constance's dark eyes and a manner that alternated between a barrister's precision and an uncle's bewildered tenderness at the sight of a niece he had not known existed, and he spent 3 days at Ashvere and left on the 30th with the particular expression of a man who has arrived expecting to meet a niece and has instead also met a duke who has made his intentions plain and who was not, under any reasonable assessment, going to be dissuaded. She stood at the front door to see her uncle off, and he held her hands in his and said, I am sorry it took me this long to find you. And she said, You are here now. And it was not nothing. It was not nothing at all. The year turned. On the 3rd day of January, in the library, with the fire and the beeswax and the books and the specific winter light through the window, he asked whether she would do him the honor of becoming his wife. He asked it the way he said everything, plainly, without ceremony, looking at her directly. She said yes. She said it once, clearly, without qualification. He took her hands. She had not been touched in anything other than the impersonal contact of service for 12 years, and the warmth of his hands around hers was so specific and so exact that she felt it settle somewhere. It was clearly always going to settle eventually, and her breath was not steady, and his was not either, which was new information and very welcome. He did not kiss her then. He kissed her 3 days later in the East Garden, where the frost was on the canes and the copper beach was bare and they were entirely alone. And he kissed her the way he said her name, which was quietly and with complete attention, and without any uncertainty about his meaning. She had kept his house's secrets, and worked its corridors, and polished its silver, and tended its roses for 12 years. She had been 15 when she was handed an impossible thing, and had carried it with care for longer than was fair. And she had done it because she was the kind of person who carried things carefully, who did not put them down, who believed that honesty asked of you even when it cost you was the only kind worth offering. He saw that. He had seen it from across the entrance hall before he had known her name. The traveling case was still in the Duchess's rooms at West Hall, packed with the Duchess's things, and the inscription inside it would stand for whatever record any solicitor cared to examine. The jointure was set. The arrangements were made. The year the Duchess had vanished and the year she had returned were both now part of the past, and the past was the past's business. What was present was the East Garden, and the frost, and the man whose hands knew where hers were, even before she reached for him. She reached for him. Spring came to Ashvere with the roses, and with the announcement in the county paper that made Mrs. Rowe cry into her apron in the most dignified possible way. It came with a letter from her uncle expressing his warmest sentiments, and a small legal document he had drawn up himself, which settled on his niece a modest independence that meant, for the first time in her life, that her position in the world did not depend entirely on anyone else's grace or attention. It came with the reopening of the East Garden and the laying of new seed and the particular smell of turned earth after a long cold. In the mornings, before the house was fully awake, he walked the perimeter of the grounds as he always had. And now she walked beside him, and they talked about the East Garden and the household, and the questions that needed answering that day. And they were also, always, talking about something else, which is the particular happiness of two people who have learned to speak plainly to one another and find they cannot stop. The copper beech put out its new leaves. The climbers sent up their first green shoots along the east wall. Constance, who had come to this house without family and without position, and without anyone who thought it particularly mattered what became of her, walked through the gate she had looked at from the servant's window 11 years ago, and the gravel was under her feet, and the man beside her said her name quietly in the way he always said it. And she was home. If this story moved you, leave a thought in the comments. Thank you for staying until the end. She had not intended to love him. She had not intended anything beyond surviving with her character intact, which was the ambition available to a woman of her position and which she had pursued with the particular stubbornness of someone who has nothing else to offer and knows it. Love was not part of the available inventory. Love was a thing that happened in drawing rooms to women with dowries and connections and the social machinery to manage its consequences. A servant who loved her employer was not a woman in love. She was a problem waiting to become visible. She understood this. She had always understood it. And she had still, despite all understanding, found herself at the east stair with roses in her hands and a pulse in her throat that had no business being there. And she had still found herself at the servant's window, watching a man walk the perimeter of the grounds in the early dark, and feeling with the specific clarity of something that will not be argued out of itself, that the distance between them was the wrongest thing in the house. There had been a night in November, deep into the cold, when the house was quiet, and she was in the housekeeper's sitting room going over the linen inventory, and she had looked up from the columns of figures at the clock on the mantel, and thought of him. He was in the library. He is alone. He sat with something that cost him, some night of the peninsula she would never be permitted to know, some specific grief that had produced the particular stillness in him that she had first read as coldness and now read as restraint. He had told her none of this. She had gathered it from small things. The way he sometimes stopped mid-sentence and returned to it a moment later. The way he held his right hand differently on cold mornings. The way he had looked at the fire in the library the morning she had told him about the Duchess and had said, after a silence, that it was a long time to carry something alone, in a voice that knew what long times cost. She had gone back to the linen inventory. She had counted sheets and pillowcases and had not gone to the library because she was a housekeeper of 26 and he was a duke of 34, and the library was his room and not hers to enter uninvited. But she had wanted to. She had wanted to with a specificity that surprised her. Not for company, not for warmth, not for the consolation of proximity, but for the smaller and more honest thing, which was that she had wanted to sit in the room with him and say nothing, and have that be enough. She thought of this in the East Garden on the first day of January, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and decided it was probably the truest thing she had ever noticed about herself. The announcement, when it came, was met by the county with the specific response of people who are surprised and who do not wish to appear surprised. Lady Hargreave was heard to say, at a card party in the first week of February, that she supposed it was very modern of the Duke to look so low, and that she trusted Miss Paley had qualities that were not immediately apparent to the general eye. This was reported to Constance by Mrs. Rowe, who reported it in the careful way of a woman who is also registering her own decided opinion on the subject of Lady Hargreave. "She is not wrong that you have qualities not immediately apparent," Mrs. Rowe said. "She is merely wrong about whether that is a liability." Constance thanked her and said that Lady Hargreave was welcome to her opinion. "Her niece," Mrs. Rowe continued as though she had not spoken, "has already accepted an offer from a Mr. Fielding of Derbyshire, who has £8,000 and is said to be very cheerful. I thought you would want to know." She had not needed to know. She was glad to know it. The county's reservations, in the event, did not outlast the spring. A duke's choice was a duke's choice, and if the woman he had chosen had been in service in his own household, she had also been in it long enough for everyone of consequence to have formed their own settled opinion of her competence, her honesty, and her precise account of every piece of silver in the house. These things mattered in a county that valued the practical over the fashionable, and Ashvere was a county that had always valued what it could rely on. He had always known this about his county, which was perhaps why he had never looked anywhere else.